All right, let's try a little thought experiment. I want you to just forget everything you know about American history for a minute. Come with me into a totally different timeline.
Picture it. It's the summer of 1789, and it is hot. I mean, it's that sticky, sweltering Philadelphia heat. The air is filled with the sounds of a new city, but there's also this deep, deep uncertainty. The revolution's over, sure, but what happens next? Honestly, nobody knows.
Because in this world, there isn't one. There's no president, there's no constitution, no Supreme Court. That big convention they had here a couple years back, yeah, that ended in a total flameout. Shouting matches, delegates walking out. The whole dream of a single, united nation just fizzled.
So what's left? A total mess. A patchwork of bickering little republics. You've got Virginia and Massachusetts acting like they're foreign enemies, slapping tariffs on each other's goods. New York is literally choking off New Jersey's economy with tolls. Down south, the states are so scared and broke, they're cutting side deals with Spain just for protection. And the whole time, the old European powers, Britain and France, are just circling, like sharks smelling blood in the water.
And here's the kicker. In this alternate reality, nobody calls this a disaster. Oh no. They spin it as a victory. It's freedom. Freedom for each state to do its own thing. Free from some big, powerful government telling them what to do.
So, let me ask you, as you're picturing this fractured, chaotic continent, does it all sound a little too wild? Like something out of a fantasy novel?
Well, here's the thing. It's not fantasy at all. Every single detail I just laid out was a real threat. A real possibility that almost blew up the Philadelphia Convention for good. All that anger from the small states, the threats from the South, it was all real. This world was one bad week away from becoming our reality.
And it all came down to these razor-thin moments. I mean, look at New York, one of the most important states. The vote to ratify the Constitution, to join the Union, it was an absolute nail-biter. Alexander Hamilton was practically begging, pleading, and arguing day and night to get it done. The final vote? 30-27.
Just three votes. Let that number sink in. The entire future of what would become the most powerful nation on Earth came down to a margin of 3 people in one room on one day.
And that right there, that's the big question we're tackling. What does it actually mean that this whole thing was so fragile? How should it change the way we think about our own history and our own world, knowing that it all could have just not happened?
Okay, so let's start with maybe the biggest and, frankly, the darkest consequence of a failed union. We have to talk about slavery.
Just look at these two paths. In our timeline, the unified Congress was basically a pressure cooker. You had abolitionists and slaveholders forced into the same room, arguing, and that pressure led to things like the ban on importing enslaved people in 1808. And eventually it exploded into the Civil War, which forced the end of slavery. But in a disunited America, well, a Southern Confederation would have 0 abolitionist voices. No northern pressure. It would have just gone on its own way, probably a lot like Brazil, which, get this, didn't end slavery until 1888.
So the grim, unavoidable truth is that without a unified country to force a violent showdown, slavery almost certainly would have lasted for decades longer. It would have eventually died out for economic reasons, not through a war for freedom. And the cost of that delay would be measured in generations of human lives.
All right, so let's jump forward to the 20th century, because a divided America doesn't just change North America, it changes the entire planet.
Think for a second about how the US became the arsenal of democracy in the world wars. It wasn't just willpower, right? It was logistics. It was this unique recipe. You had a single, massive continental economy, all protected by the same tariffs, connected by a huge railroad network, all running on one stable currency. That combination created an industrial powerhouse like nothing the world had ever seen.
But in our alternate timeline, those ingredients never get mixed. You've got a handful of small, suspicious republics. They're not partners, they're rivals. There's no giant, unified industrial machine. There's simply no arsenal.
And the fallout from that is staggering. World War I breaks out in 1914, but in 1917, there's no unified America to jump in and tip the scales. So the war just grinds on and on for years, becoming even more horrific. Fast forward to the 1940s, there's no industrial giant to outproduce the Axis powers. And the Cold War? The Soviet Union expands, and there's no single powerful opponent to push back. The entire map of the 20th century is completely rewritten.
So, you might be thinking, okay, this is a fun little history game, but it's so much more than that. This whole exercise, it actually helps us understand the world we're living in right now.
I love this quote because it just hits the nail on the head. Thinking about what could have been isn't about escaping our reality. It's like putting on a new pair of glasses that helps you see your own world more clearly, how fragile it is, how unlikely it is, and what the real consequences were.
I mean, think about it. We argue about America, we love it, we hate it, we criticize it, but how often do we stop and just feel the sheer contingency of it all? The fact that it was never guaranteed to exist in the first place. It was stitched together and it almost wasn't.
And that's the perfect way to think about it. That other path, that world of fractured American nations, it's not some ghost story to scare us. It's a measuring stick. It's something we can hold up to our own timeline to really appreciate what was at stake and what was actually built. And if you want a perfect human example of this, just look at these two revolutionaries, James Madison in North America and Simón Bolívar in South America. They had basically the same dream, a large, unified republic. But Madison's vision barely, and I mean barely, succeeded. Bolívar's failed, collapsing under the very same pressures of regional fighting and jealousy. So one guy goes down in history as a founder. The other died saying he had plowed the sea, that all his work had been for nothing.
And that's the final thought I really want to leave you with. What if the only meaningful difference between these two men was luck? What if James Madison was just a Simón Bolívar who, at the most critical moment imaginable, just happened to get those 3 votes? Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
Part 2. What actually happened? The miracle at Philadelphia. Okay, so today we are going deep. We're going to go inside a single sweltering room in Philadelphia where, really against all odds, a group of men took this desperate gamble. A gamble that would not only forge a nation, but would also pretty much define the modern world. We're here to figure out how this so-called miracle actually happened. So let's start at the end. Our story kicks off on the final dramatic day of the Constitutional Convention. I mean, after a long, brutally hot summer of just furious debate, this was it. This was the moment of truth, the one day that would decide the fate of the entire American experiment. I want you to just picture this. It's the Pennsylvania State House, and for months, the windows have been literally nailed shut. Why? To keep any whispers of the explosive arguments happening inside from leaking out. The air is thick, tensions are just sky high, and 39 guys are about to put their names on a document that, let's be honest, many of them in their hearts believed had almost no chance of success. And there's this one moment that just captures this fragile hope perfectly. It comes from an 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin. He was so frail, he actually had to be carried into the convention hall every single day. And all summer, he'd been staring at this carving of a sun on the back of George Washington's chair, and he just kept wondering, is that a sunrise for our new nation, or is it a sunset on the whole revolution? Well, on this final day, he decides it's rising. It's a really beautiful moment of optimism, but it was an optimism that almost never happened. You see, to really understand Franklin's relief, we have to grasp just how close the new nation was to total collapse. This convention wasn't some quiet academic exercise. No, this was a last-ditch act of desperation. So why was it such a gamble? Well, because the United States as a country was fundamentally broken. I mean, it was falling apart less than a decade after it was even born. The country's first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, was, to put it mildly, a disaster. The federal government was essentially powerless. It couldn't collect taxes to pay its Revolutionary War debts or even fund an army. It couldn't enforce its own laws. You had states acting like 13 petty rival nations, printing their own worthless money, slapping tariffs on goods from their neighbors. It was complete and utter economic chaos. And the perfect illustration of this chaos, Shays' Rebellion. Just a year before the convention, you have all these indebted farmers in Massachusetts taking up arms against their government. And the national government was so broke and so weak it couldn't do a single thing. A private army funded by wealthy merchants had to be raised just to put the rebellion down. For leaders like Washington and Madison, this was the ultimate nightmare. It was this terrifying sign that the republic was failing and anarchy was right around the corner. And inside the convention itself, man, it was a powder keg. Delegates from small states like Delaware were threatening to walk out and maybe even align with a foreign power if they didn't get equal representation. Southern delegates made it crystal clear they would abandon the whole project if anyone seriously challenged the institution of slavery. And then there's Rhode Island. They were so suspicious of a powerful central government, they didn't even bother to show up. Get this, even the heroes of the revolution were deeply skeptical. Patrick Henry, the guy who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death," flat out refused to attend. He said he smelled a rat. He literally suspected the entire convention was just a plot by the elite to create some new, powerful monarchy that would crush the very liberties they had just fought a war to win. And yet, against all of those odds, they actually succeeded. The document they created didn't just save their fledgling nation, it went on to remake the entire world. Somehow, 39 men signed, and miraculously, the states ratified. The Republic survived its infancy, and what happened next was a rise to global dominance unlike anything the world had ever seen. So over the next 2.5 centuries, that improbable union became the axis around which the modern world turns. And it wasn't just about size, it was about gravity. It built the largest, most innovative economy in history, creating entire industries from nothing. Its military power projected influence into every ocean and every continent. Its culture, our movies, our music, our brands, it became a global phenomenon. And the US dollar became the bedrock of the world's financial system. For better or for worse, the United States became the central player on the global stage. Okay, but that's all grand geopolitical stuff, right? What does a dusty old document signed way back in 1787 actually have to do with your life, right now, in this moment? Well, it turns out, a lot more than you might think. Just think about this for a second. The internet you're using right now, it grew out of a US government research project called DARPA. That kind of long-term, ambitious investment was only possible because the Constitution created a stable federal government that could fund it. The global financial system that dictates interest rates and trade, it's anchored in Washington and New York, a direct legacy of the economic powerhouse that union created. The fact that English is the global language of business and science, that's a direct result of the immense American economic and cultural influence of the 20th century. Even the very idea of a modern liberal democracy with a written constitution and checks and balances, it has American fingerprints all over it. Which, of course, brings us to the most important question of all. A question that should kind of plant a splinter in your mind and make you rethink everything we've just talked about. Was any of this inevitable? All that global power, all those fingerprints on your daily life, was it all just destined to be this way? There are really two ways to look at this whole story. Was the American Union the natural, logical endpoint of its colonial history and revolutionary ideals, or was it something far more fragile, a wildly improbable event, a near miracle that hinged on a handful of flawed people making just enough right choices at the exact right moment? I mean, really think about it. Was it destiny? Or was it, as some historians argue, a near miraculous convergence of personalities and circumstances that could have so easily gone the other way? And that leads us to our final, lingering thought. What if Franklin had seen a setting sun? What if the convention had collapsed in anger and distrust? What if those 13 states had just spun off into bickering rivals, ripe for European meddling? What would our world actually look like today if America had never truly united? All right, let's jump right in. This is part 3, The Breaking Point, Politics and Power, 1740 to 1787. So to really get a handle on this, we're going to zoom in on one single crucial year, a year that honestly lays out the whole conflict of our story and pretty much sets the stage for everything that follows. The year is 1754, and it is just packed with contradiction. I mean, think about this. Out in the Pennsylvania wilderness, a young, ambitious George Washington basically kind of accidentally kicks off a world war. A war that, ironically, is going to be the very thing that forces the colonies to work together. But at the exact same time, in a room in Albany, those same colonies get a formal chance to unite, and they just flat out say no. It's this bizarre push and pull we really need to get into. And this is really the first big takeaway. This idea of unity, it didn't just bubble up from the people. No way. It was a political proposal, dreamed up by thinkers like Franklin, decades before anyone was even whispering about revolution. And the colonies, they wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. So this was Franklin's big idea, the Albany Plan. And it was pretty ambitious. He proposed a grand council with delegates from all the colonies. And this council would have had real power. The power to tax, to raise an army, to manage all that Western land. You have to remember, for the 1750s, this was a completely radical concept. So why did it go down in flames so spectacularly? Well, here's the thing. Nobody wanted it. The colonies themselves looked at it and saw a huge threat to their own local power. They did not want some new central government telling them what to do. And at the same time, the British Crown looks at it from London and thinks, whoa, this is way too much independence. It was basically doomed from the start because it stepped on everyone's toes. And to really understand that fear, you have to get this one crucial thing. The 13 colonies were not one big happy family just waiting to become a country. Not even close. They were more like 3 totally separate civilizations, each with its own unique and often clashing way of life. Just look at how different they were. You've got New England, all about Atlantic trade, commerce, and this really strong tradition of town meetings and self-governance. Then you go down to the southern colonies, and it's a completely different world. It's an aristocratic society run by a wealthy gentry class built on plantation agriculture. And then, sandwiched right in the middle, you have the middle colonies, a total melting pot, ethnically diverse, and full of its own conflicts. We're not just talking about different accents here. We're talking about fundamentally different societies. This quote really just nails it. A merchant in Boston felt a closer connection to someone in London than they did to someone in Charleston. Think about that. Their entire world was oriented east-west, across the ocean to Britain. It wasn't north-south, connecting with each other. They just didn't think of themselves as being on the same team. So, what changed? I mean, what could possibly get these totally different worlds to even sit in the same room together? Well, the answer is simple: a common enemy. It wasn't some newfound brotherly love that brought them together. It was a shared enemy, the British Crown, that finally, reluctantly, pushed them together. Okay, so remember that war Washington helped kick off? Well, after it was over, Britain was in debt, and they looked at the colonies and said, all right, you guys need to start paying for your own defense. And that led to this whole cascade of new taxes and rules. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. Each one just cranked up the pressure a little more, and it forced the colonies to, for the first time, actually talk to each other and figure out a common response. And their response really boiled down to this one powerful idea. Now, at first, it was just a slogan against a few specific taxes, but inside that simple phrase was the DNA of a full-blown revolution. It was the single idea that took a boring tax dispute and turned it into a fight for independence. But here's the twist. The war ends, they win, the common enemy is gone, and guess what happens? All those old rivalries, all those deep divisions, they come roaring right back. The first attempt at a government, the Articles of Confederation, created a union that was, well, a union in name only. John Adams, he just summed it up perfectly. He said trying to get these 13 states to act together was like getting 13 clocks to strike at once. I mean, can you imagine the chaos? That was the reality of trying to run a country where every state was basically its own little nation, all pulling in different directions. And let me tell you, the whole system was just a disaster. The Central Congress had no power to tax. They literally had to go around and beg the states for money. You had states putting taxes on goods from other states, basically waging trade wars with each other. And get this, the army almost fell apart at Valley Forge, not because of a big British victory, but because their own government was so disorganized it couldn't even get them food and supplies. You know, you can make a really strong case that America won the war despite this chaos, not because of its strength. What really tipped the scales? French money, French troops, and especially the French Navy. The huge victory at Yorktown, you could say that was just as much a French win as it was an American one. So by 1787, things are dire. The whole country is teetering on the edge of complete collapse. And that brings us to the Constitutional Convention. Now, we tend to think of this as some kind of noble philosophical debate, but the reality, it was a secret, desperate, last-ditch gamble to keep the entire American experiment from completely falling apart. And the one thing that made it all possible was secrecy. They locked the doors and swore an oath not to talk about it. Why? Because it allowed them to be honest. It let them throw out the old, failing articles and actually draft something brand new, without their home states freaking out and shutting the whole thing down. And this really gets to the heart of what they were doing. Take the Great Compromise, the deal that gave us the House and the Senate. That wasn't some brilliant stroke of political philosophy. It was a messy, ugly, practical deal they had to make to stop the small states from just walking out the door and ending the whole idea of a United States right then and there. It was about pure survival. When you look at it this way, America's success suddenly seems a lot more fragile, a lot less inevitable. The fact that this thing held together at all is, well, it's kind of a miracle.
because you see, they weren't following some proven recipe for success. There was no blueprint. In fact, they were swimming against the tide of history, a powerful current that had already wrecked so many other attempts at union.
I mean, just look around the world at that time. Gran Colombia, the German Confederation, the Central American Federation, they all tried to do the same thing, to unite different states. And they all failed. They were all torn apart by the exact same things threatening America: different economies, clashing cultures, and that deep, deep fear of giving up local power. And that brings us right back to our big question. History was at a fork in the road in Philadelphia in 1787, and it so easily could have gone the other way. So what if? What if they had failed? What if America had just fractured like all the others before it even really began? It just goes to show you, this whole debate we still have today between federal power and states' rights, it's not new. It is baked right into the DNA of the country from the absolute beginning.
Part 4. Economic and Demographic Fault Lines 1750-1790. So we're going to tackle a pretty wild question in this one. How did the United States win the Revolution, only to find itself on the absolute brink of collapse just a few years later? I mean, it seems crazy, right?
To get a feel for this, I want you to imagine something. It's 1784, you're a merchant in Baltimore, a guy named William Patterson. The war's finally over, but you are fuming. Why? Because you just found out New York is taxing goods coming in from New Jersey, which means your cargo is getting hit with taxes twice. And his angry words, man, they nail the reality of the moment. The states, they weren't partners. They were basically at war with each other, economically speaking.
And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. Why? I mean, seriously, why was America so viciously divided right after they all fought a war together? Well, the answer isn't just about politics. It goes way deeper, down to these massive economic and demographic fault lines that were literally threatening to rip the whole country apart before it even got started.
So to really get this, you have to understand one crucial thing. The 13 states, they were not one big happy economic family. Not even close. They were more like three completely different competing economies that just happened to be stuck together by history. Let's take a look at what that actually meant.
You had two systems that were just polar opposites. Up in New England, you've got this merchant and shipping economy. They're building ships, they're starting to make their own stuff, so what do they want? They need protective tariffs to keep cheap British goods out. But then you look at the South, and it's the exact reverse. Their whole economy is built on plantations, exporting things like tobacco and rice. For them, tariffs are a disaster. They want free trade so they can buy cheaper stuff from Britain, not expensive manufactured goods from Boston. So you see the problem, right? A policy that's a lifeline for a factory in Massachusetts is a dagger to the heart of a planter in Virginia. They were playing two completely different games.
And then, stuck right in the middle, you have places like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. They're big cities. Philly, New York, are becoming these giant commercial hubs for the whole continent. They kind of had a foot in both camps. They're processing food from their own farms, but they're also the bankers and traders for both the North and the South. This put them in a really weird spot. They were the critical link, but also this deeply conflicted middle ground.
But these economic clashes, that was only one part of the problem. There was another huge crack forming in the foundation of the country, and this one was all about people. A massive population boom was sending settlers spilling over the mountains to the west, and that created a whole new set of headaches.
Just look at the numbers for a second. In just 40 years, from 1750 to 1790, the population just skyrockets from about 1.2 million to almost 4 million people. It's insane. And most of that growth wasn't happening in the old cities. It was on the frontier, people flooding into the Shenandoah Valley, the Carolina backcountry, pushing right over the Appalachian Mountains. This wasn't just a statistic, it was this huge human wave, and it was creating a totally new and very different kind of American society.
And these folks out west, they had a whole different set of demands, right? They needed roads to sell their crops. They needed the military to protect them from the Native American nations whose land they were moving onto. They needed to know the land they were clearing was actually theirs. But the powerful folks back on the coast, the ones running the state governments, they pretty much ignored them. And this opened up a brand new fight. It wasn't just North versus South anymore. Now it was East versus West. I mean, it got so bad that people in what we now call Kentucky and Tennessee were seriously talking about just breaking off and forming their own countries, or maybe even cutting a deal with Spain just to get access to the Mississippi River for trade. The Union was already fraying.
Okay, so you've got all these tensions just simmering below the surface, right? North versus south, east versus west. Well, the thing that finally lit the fuse and made the whole thing explode was debt. A mountain of it, left over from the Revolutionary War.
And this kicked off the biggest political battle of the 1780s. Here's how it worked. A bunch of northern bankers and speculators had bought up old war bonds for next to nothing. Now they were demanding that the federal government take on all the individual states' debts and pay those bonds back at full value. If that happened, they'd get incredibly rich. But the southern states, like Virginia, had already busted their humps to pay off most of their own debts, so they looked at this and said, "No way. You want to tax our farmers just to make a bunch of northern speculators rich?" You can imagine how well that went over. The fight was so vicious, it basically froze the government.
And eventually, all this tension just blew up. In 1786, in Massachusetts, farmers were getting crushed by these new taxes meant to pay off that war debt. So what did they do? They picked up their guns and rebelled against their own state government. This event, Shays' Rebellion, absolutely terrified people like George Washington and James Madison. And here's why. The national government, under the Articles of Confederation, was completely powerless. They couldn't do a thing. In the end, a private army, funded by rich merchants in Boston, had to be hired to crush the rebellion. It was the ultimate wake-up call. The system was broken. The country was spiraling into anarchy. So this crisis basically put America at a crossroads. There were two paths forward, two completely different futures for the continent. One of them is the history that we all learned in school. But the other one, well, back then, the other one looked a whole lot more likely.
Path number one is our timeline. The Constitution of 1787 gets written, and it creates a single economic market. It gives a new, stronger federal government the power to deal with debt, make a single currency, and control trade between the states. It basically forces everyone to play on the same team. But then there's path number two, the alternate timeline. In that world, the Constitution never happens. The Union just falls apart. The states turn on each other, waging trade wars. The West gets cut loose and starts making its own deals with Britain or Spain. It's not a country anymore. It's just chaos.
And look, this wasn't some far-fetched theory. People were talking about this for real. You probably would have ended up with a Confederation of New England, focused on shipping and industry. You'd have a massive Republic of Virginia running the Southern agricultural empire, and a commercial league of the Middle States trying to play everyone off each other. This is the logical endpoint of all those economic divisions we talked about. North America would have just become another Europe, a continent of smaller, squabbling, rival nations.
And that's really the thing to take away from all this. The United States wasn't destined to happen. It was anything but inevitable. The Constitution, it wasn't a sure thing. It was a Hail Mary pass. It was a desperate bet that a stronger government could somehow hold all these warring pieces together long enough for them to become a country. And it was a bet that in 1787 could have gone the other way so easily.
Part 5. Cultural and Social Fractures, 1740 to 1790. You know, before the United States was a country, it was really just an idea, or more accurately, it was a whole bunch of competing ideas, all wrestling for control. This is the story of those deep fractures that were dividing America long before anyone even thought about firing the first shots of the Revolution.
So let's go back to the year 1741. On paper, the American colonists were all subjects of the same king. But one people? Not even close. They weren't just separated by miles of rough terrain. They were separated by their most fundamental beliefs about God, about freedom, about society itself. It's really no exaggeration to say they were living in two completely different moral universes.
So how do we really get our heads around these two opposing worlds? Well, I think the best way is to zoom in on two specific men. Their lives happening in the very same year on the very same continent perfectly show us the cracks that were already running right through colonial society.
Okay, picture this. It's a Sunday morning in Massachusetts. The local minister, a guy named Jonathan Edwards, gets up to speak. And he delivers a sermon so absolutely terrifying that people are literally grabbing onto their pews to keep from fainting. He tells them that God holds them over the pit of hell just like you'd hold a spider over a fire. This was the Great Awakening. It was this intense, personal, and surprisingly democratic religious movement that was just tearing through the North.
Now, let's travel hundreds of miles south, down to South Carolina. On that exact same Sunday, a wealthy planter named Henry Middleton is at its very proper Anglican church. No talk of hellfire and spiders here, nope. The sermon is all about social hierarchy, divine order, knowing your place. And then Middleton goes home to his plantation,
a place built on the forced labor of 400 enslaved people. You see, Edwards and Middleton, these aren't just two different men. They represent two completely incompatible visions for what America should be.
And it's so important to get this. This wasn't just some simple North versus South thing. The colonies were more like a patchwork quilt of cultures, a nation of strangers, really, and each group had its own blueprint for how a society ought to work.
That Great Awakening we talked about, it was like a cultural earthquake. It really pushed this idea of equality, teaching regular folks that they had a right, even a duty, to judge things for themselves. And that, of course, was a direct challenge to the old authorities. It even planted some of the very first seeds of abolitionism. But here's the absolute key. The tremors from that earthquake were really only felt in the North and out on the frontier. The slaveholding South, it remained almost completely unmoved.
And then, on top of the religious divides, you had these deep ethnic and cultural splits. I mean, just think about it for a second. How do you build one single nation out of so many different kinds of people? You've got German immigrants in Pennsylvania who are deeply suspicious of any big central power. You've got Scots-Irish settlers out on the frontier who are pretty much hostile to any kind of government. You've got Dutch communities in New York holding on tight to their own traditions, and Jewish communities who knew from painful experience that a strong government could be a protector or a persecutor. These weren't just cultural quirks. These were fundamentally different ideas about the entire purpose of government.
So you've got all these religious and cultural divisions just simmering away under the surface. But there was one issue that acted like a massive amplifier, a moral fault line that made any kind of real, lasting union seem, well, almost impossible.
The one thing that was hanging over every conversation, every debate, the issue that threatened to just shatter any chance at unity, was the institution of slavery. It took every other disagreement they had and turned it into this huge, irreconcilable fight over the very definition of what it means to be human.
You know, the solution the founders came up with, the infamous 3/5 compromise, it wasn't a solution at all, was it? It was a political calculation, a kind of cynical math problem designed to hold the country together by basically writing a massive moral contradiction right into its DNA. It didn't solve the problem, it just kicked the can down a very, very blood-soaked road.
And you have to understand, the Southern position on this was crystal clear. As South Carolina's Charles Pinckney put it, they would never join a union that so much as threatened the institution of slavery. For them, this wasn't just about money or economics, it was about defending what they saw as the natural order of the world, a social pyramid built on a foundation of race.
So this brings us to a really fascinating what if. What if that fragile compromise had just fallen apart? What if they hadn't been able to paper over that huge moral crack in the nation's foundation? Let's take a little trip down that alternate timeline.
So here's where the timeline splits. In this other reality, without the delicate compromise of the Constitution, that cultural incompatibility that was always there just comes to the surface. The cracks don't get patched up, they break wide open, and they do it almost right away.
The result is a clean break. Those deep moral and cultural divides, they don't get resolved through debate or war. They get resolved by geography. A Northern Confederation is formed, and it slowly starts moving toward emancipation. And a Southern Confederation is formed, and it doubles down on slavery, now completely free from any nagging criticism from the North.
And over time, this political split would lead to something really profound. Those regional identities would harden into truly separate national ones. You'd end up with two Americas sharing a single continent. You can just see how two totally distinct nations would have grown out of this. Both would claim the legacy of the Revolution in 1776, but they would see it in radically different ways. For the North, 1776 becomes a story about human equality and natural rights. For the South, it's a story about defending their rights and their property from a tyrannical central government. Two nations, born from the very same event, but with basically opposite souls.
And here is the absolutely critical takeaway. This alternate history, it isn't some fantasy. It's just the natural outcome of the identities that already existed back in the 1780s. The Constitution didn't magically erase these massive differences. It just held them in a very fragile, very temporary suspension.
And that, of course, brings us to the final and maybe haunting question. This whole thought experiment shows us just how easily America could have fractured into separate countries from the very beginning. The Constitution created a political union, sure, a fragile truce holding these opposing worlds together. But when you look at all of American history, even right up to today, you just have to ask yourself, did those deep cultural cracks ever truly heal?
Part 6, Technology, Infrastructure, and the Geography of Disunion, 1750 to 1790. We have this idea that the United States was, destined to be. But what if it wasn't? What if the very land itself, the mountains, the rivers, the incredible distances, made a single nation seem like a crazy idea? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into. 3 weeks. Just let that sink in. In 1787, while the founders are in Philadelphia trying to hammer out a constitution, that was the absolute fastest you could get from Boston to Savannah. And that's not just some fun fact for trivia night. No, that one number, it unlocks everything. It shows you why a united America was such a radical, almost impossible concept. And yeah, this was no scenic road trip. The reality was brutal. We're talking about rutted dirt tracks that you could barely call roads, rivers with no bridges, and just miles and miles of dangerous, empty terrain. The physical separation was so complete that communication was almost a joke. Seriously, a farmer down in Georgia and a fisherman up in Maine, they weren't just in different states, they might as well have been on different planets. And this, right here, this comparison tells you the real story. See, the colonies were never built to be connected to each other. They were set up like individual spokes on a giant wheel, and the hub was all the way over in London. Every bit of infrastructure, every postal route, it all pointed out to the sea. The whole system was designed to ship resources out to Britain, not to help people in Charleston talk to folks in New York. So that brings us to the fundamental question, doesn't it? If a nation is really about a shared identity, a common purpose, how in the world do you build that when people are so physically isolated they can't even communicate? This wasn't just a small problem. It was a massive hurdle threatening the entire American experiment before it even began. All right, let's break down these forces that were pulling everything apart. Because you have to remember, back in 1787, union was the weird, unnatural idea. The default setting for North America was disunion, and the land itself was the main reason why. First up, the mountains. The Appalachians weren't just a pretty view. They were a wall, a giant physical barrier running right down the continent. It sealed off the coastal settlements from the vast interior, and just as important, it made traveling by land between the north and the south a nightmare. And then you have the rivers. You look at this list, and you see they all have one thing in common. They were one-way highways to the Atlantic Ocean. Perfect if you wanted to get tobacco or timber to a port and ship it to Europe, but completely useless if you wanted to connect to New York with Virginia. Instead, they sliced the coast into these separate economic bubbles, each one basically its own little proto-nation. On top of all that, the technology of the day just cemented this localism. Before steam power, moving anything heavy over land was incredibly expensive. So your whole world was small. Your mill, your forge, your customers, everything was local. This created these tight-knit local economies, which naturally led to local politics and really strong local identities. The idea of a national economy, it was pure fantasy. So what if those forces had won out? Let's take a quick trip into an alternate timeline, one where the Constitution fails and America just stays a bunch of separate regional republics. What would that world actually look like? Well, in that world, with no federal government planning things for the whole country, all infrastructure becomes totally self-serving. New England is all about trade, right? So they build canals to their own ports. The Middle Republic builds the incredible Erie Canal, but only to make New York City rich. And the South, reliant on its rivers and deeply skeptical of big government projects, it pretty much neglects to build any roads at all. And this isn't just a minor difference in priorities. This is a fundamental split that changes everything. The North invests, it innovates, it attracts money and immigrants from all over the world. The South, even after the cotton gin makes it fabulously wealthy, resists that kind of change. It gets rich, sure, but it becomes economically frozen, trapped in a system that fights tooth and nail against innovation. So what happens when you have these very different, very wealthy neighbors sharing a continent with no one in charge? They don't just hold hands and sing songs. They become rivals. This timeline gives you a taste of what that looks like. Instead of having debates in Congress, you have actual tariff wars over who gets to profit from a canal. Instead of diplomacy, you have border skirmishes with your neighbors that could explode into open war at any moment. And the push west, it's not a national project. It's a frantic and dangerous land grab between competing countries. This quote from our source materials just nails it. A disunited North America doesn't become this peaceful paradise. It becomes a carbon copy of 19th-century Europe, a messy continent of rival powers, constantly shifting alliances, and the endless threat of war. Okay, so that was the alternate reality. Let's pull this back to our timeline, because those powerful forces of division, the geography, the economics, they didn't just magically disappear when the Constitution was signed. Not at all. You can see how it all cascaded in our own history. The climate led to different kinds of farming. Those different farming systems led to completely different labor systems, free versus slave. These two systems were always going to be on a collision course. In our history, we had a central government acting as a referee, desperately trying to manage these tensions with tariffs and laws. It was messy, it was ugly, but it all happened under one national roof. And this, right here, is the most critical takeaway. That exact same split from our alternate timeline, the industrial North versus the agricultural South, it happened in our real history too. The only difference, because they were all part of the same country, the conflict that was bound to happen wasn't an international war between nations, it was a civil war. Which leaves us with this final, lingering question. Forging a union was an incredible achievement, a political miracle that defied geography. But did it actually solve these deep-seated divisions? Or did it just force them all to live together under one very tense and often turbulent roof? That's definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining this explainer.
Part 7. Conclusion. The world that almost was, and the world that is. All right, so for this final part, we're going to do something a little different. A thought experiment. Let's explore a world that almost was. I mean, it came so close to existing. A world's built from the exact same ingredients as ours, just put together in a totally different way. So, I want you to do something for me. Close your eyes. Picture it. The year is 1850. But this isn't the 1850 you read about in the history books. Nope, there is no single, massive United States stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Instead, what you see is a patchwork of rival nations, kind of like Europe. See, in this timeline, that pivotal moment, the Constitutional Convention of 1787, it failed. It just fizzled out. The colonies decided, nah, we're better off on our own, and they all went their separate ways. So, what does this fractured continent actually look like? Let's take a little tour, shall we? First up, in the north, you've got the Republic of New England. This place is an industrial powerhouse, right? We're talking textile mills, bustling Atlantic trade, and of course, those prestigious universities like Harvard and Yale. And here's the crucial part, they got rid of slavery, abolished it way back in 1808. Okay, head a little south from there and you run smack into the continent's financial giant, the Commercial Republic of the Middle States. The capital? New York City, of course, and it's buzzing. This place is all about one thing, business, money. And slavery? Well, it's not really a moral issue for them, it's just bad for business. Doesn't fit with their wage-based economy. And then you get to the South, the Confederate States. This is a totally different world. It's an agricultural oligarchy, basically run by a handful of super powerful planter families. Their whole economy is fueled by cotton, and it makes the white population incredibly wealthy. But their constitution, wow, it doesn't just permit slavery, it protects it forever. So you can see, these aren't just, minor disagreements. We're talking deep, deep divisions that can't be fixed. You've got the slavery-free industrial North, the commerce-obsessed, kind of indifferent middle, and the fiercely pro-slavery agricultural South. Yeah, they might trade with each other, but the tension, it's thick enough to cut with a knife. In fact, they almost went to war over it back in the 1820s. And with no single dominant US-style power, the rest of the continent is just a free-for-all. It's a geopolitical chessboard. You've got these smaller republics popping up in places like the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, and the European powers, oh, they are loving this. They're still major players. Spain's got Florida, and get this, because it's a huge departure from our timeline, Britain swoops in and buys the entire Louisiana territory from Napoleon. Okay, so fast forward. What does a century of this kind of division look like? I mean, how does this one big change, this fractured continent, completely rewrite the history of the entire world? Let's dig into the long-term consequences. The first thing, and honestly the most profound and disturbing difference, is slavery. Without the pressure of a unified nation pushing back, there's no civil war. So in the Southern Confederation, slavery just continues. It endures. And over the decades, it morphs into something that looks a lot like 20th century apartheid, a permanent, legally enforced racial caste system just baked into the society.
And the domino effect from there is just staggering. Think about it. No Louisiana Purchase by the US? That means the whole idea of manifest destiny, of a nation destined to stretch from coast to coast, it never even gets off the ground. There's no transcontinental railroad. Fast forward to 1917, World War I breaks out, and there's no single American giant to come in and tip the scales. The war? It could end in a stalemate, or maybe even a German victory. And the American century that defined the world after 1945? Yeah, that just never happens. But here's a twist, a really unexpected consequence. Because you have all these weaker republics just squabbling amongst themselves and with Europe, no one power is strong enough to just roll over the entire continent. And what does that mean? It means Native American nations like the Lakota and the Comanche survive for much, much longer. As sovereign powers, they can actually play their rivals against each other to maintain their independence. Okay, now, open your eyes. Welcome back to our world. The one that exists only because that messy, uncertain meeting in Philadelphia back in 1787 somehow succeeded. The world you are sitting in right this second was never, ever guaranteed.
Just think about the world around you for a second. That phone in your hand, probably designed in California. The global internet you're using, it was born in American universities. The fact that you're probably listening to this in English, the world's dominant language for business and culture, that's a direct result of American power. Our entire modern global system, it's all built on the foundation of a single, united America. But here's the kicker. The really uncomfortable truth. The existence of that single, united America, it was basically a historical accident. Man, it was such a close call. I mean, this whole thing was so fragile, you could have blown it over with a feather. George Washington, the guy whose prestige held the whole thing together, he almost didn't even show up to the convention. The great compromise that saved the entire project, it passed by one single vote. And in huge states like Virginia and New York, the final ratification came down to just a few guys. If any one of them had changed their mind, poof, we'd be living in that other world. And that brings us to the real gut punch, the central lesson of this whole alternative history. The United States wasn't destiny. It wasn't, divinely ordained or inevitable. It was a choice made by flawed, imperfect people arguing in a hot room against incredible odds. And they could have so easily and even logically chosen to just walk away. So that brings us to today. Because if you think these historical breaking points, these moments where everything could have gone differently, are safely locked away in a history book, well, that's a comforting illusion, but it's not true. They're not in the past. The exact same fault lines that almost cracked the country apart before it even started, they are still with us. That regional rivalry? Check. Economic self-interest pitting one part of the country against another? Check. Cultural contempt, a distrust of central authority, and yeah, the deep, painful legacy of slavery, they never really went away. They just kind of go dormant for a while, and then they erupt again. We saw it in 1861, we saw it in the 1960s, and you can feel those tremors again right now. So in the end, this whole trip to an alternate reality, it's not really about history, is it? It's a mirror. The experiment that started in that hot Philly summer of 1787, it's not finished. It's not a done deal. It has to be chosen again and again by every single generation. So the real question isn't about what those guys in powdered wigs decided back then. The real question is, what are we, right here, right now, gonna choose?